Now, we're going to dive a little more into the technical details of, how we technically accomplish each one. So, the unified Eyecare workflow is basically an integration profile. So that's the profile, the overall profile that kind of establishes all these different workflows. But there's essentially different actors within those integration profiles, that are defined. So now these actors are designed to essentially be moved around. Like, maybe the practice management system doesn't realistically, maybe the patient registration source is coming from somewhere else. Maybe the appointment scheduler is coming somewhere else. So it does not necessarily, explicitly design that only a practice management system can have these capabilities. We've essentially just grouped them together so that, we recognize that a practice management system will typically, serve these functions. But the reality is all of these actors are portable and transferable, so that if you do have a system that maybe doesn't, exactly match this model that we've defined here, you could still perform those actions, or you can still be an actor without necessarily being defined as an electronic health record system or a practice management system. So in this case, the practice management system is going to be the patient registration source. Why? Because that is the source of truth in most systems. When a patient is scheduled for an appointment, a front desk person or somebody who's taking a phone call is not going to be putting these demographics into an EHR. They're going to be putting it into the practice management system. So they are a source for that patient registration, and as a result, that's the actor that they're going to incorporate into their, into their system. And they're also, scheduling appointments. And then finally, they're also billing those charges. But the electronic health record system needs data from the practice management system. So in this case, they need it a different way. So the source is the practice management system, but the electronic health record system is a consumer of that patient registration. So essentially the patient registration consumer is an actor that the EHR system or role that they'll assume. And so if you're an electronic health record system, then essentially you're going to want to be a patient registration consumer, maybe an order filler or an appointment consumer, and then when you're a practice management system, you'll be the source, for those things and the processor for that. Now, something to keep in mind that, in this technical profile, in comparison to previous ones, the merge patient IDs, that is an actor that is essentially optional at this point. We recognize that is a complicated, process, and maybe we don't necessarily want patients to automatically be merged for different technical reasons. So that, in previous profiles, that was a requirement. A change with a unified, is that is become an optional thing. And the same thing goes with charge posted. Charge posted is a feature. Some EHR systems may not even have charge generation capabilities. So that again is an optional thing. So we can go to the next slide. So again, going through the details now, this is not intended to be a technical call, so we don't really want to dive too much into the details, but this is just going to give you an example of what, how the actors are organized within the real world Model 1. So again, we see the practice management system as the patient registration source and the appointment scheduler, typically. Then the EHR system is the order filler, the patient registration consumer and the appointment consumer. And then we have, an acquisition modality. So with Real World Model 1, you can see the acquisition modality actor is essentially talking to the order filter, and it talks to that through the query modality worklist transaction. So I'm not going to talk too much about the transactions because, the goal of this is not to confuse you with all these technical details, but it's just to give you an overall picture of what these specific transactions look like and how the actors are kind of organized in the typical real-world model. Now, if we go to the real-world, and then finally, just buttoning up this, when the acquisition modality, is going to essentially store these images to an image manager. But as you can see, there's also kind of a little tie there between the order filler actor and the image manager. So, you have options for a procedure scheduled and the patient demographics. So the PACS imaging system needs the patient demographics as well. So, those demographics are being supplied to the image manager, through the order filler actor. And then, finally, at some point, you may have a different imaging display system that, because the PACS system realistically is just a PACS system. It literally just receives images and supplies images. It doesn't necessarily have image display capabilities. So we may have a different image display softwares that may be interested in those images. So, there's transactions to essentially query these images from the PACS system and then to actually retrieve them. So, one transaction is essentially, hey, give me a list of images that are out there, and then the next one is, I want this specific image, give me the actual image. Now, if we go to the real-world model 2, okay, there's some differences now. Because we don't have an imaging or standalone PACS imaging system in the mix. We have an electronic healthcare record system that has DICOM capabilities and also may have imaging display capabilities. So a lot of those actors that were necessary in Real World Model 2 are no longer required. So in this case, the PM largely stays the same, but the electronic healthcare record now essentially becomes the source for the work list and is the place where images are stored. Now, the key thing is that you need to keep in mind that in Real World Model 2, we're assuming that there is no archive. Okay, that is the technical definition for an archive is essentially a PACS system that is intended to store images for a very long time. You'll typically see a PACS system in a hospital environment. Hospitals, they have very robust PACS systems that are designed to store MRIs and X-rays for long periods of times, and after a certain amount of time, they may archive it and do all sorts of special operations. And so as a result, the PACS system is a very safe place for images. It's intended to be long-term, and it's intended to have every image that is ever generated. Whereas in Real World Model 2, we recognize that we don't necessarily need that sophisticated type of PACS system. We want an electronic healthcare system, to just display real important images. So in this case, the acquisition modality will store key images. Okay, and that is a very important concept for acquisition devices to understand, is that if you generate, let's say, 100 images in a single acquisition, maybe only 5 of them are really medically relevant. Or, the other images are just poorly taken, they're blurry, there's all sorts of issues with the images. You may only want this one image that is really clear and focused in on exactly what you want. So in this case, we have a concept of being able to selectively decide what images you want and then store those images onto the electronic healthcare record system. Now, this was one of the major reasons why previous workflows didn't work, because they didn't really consider this reality that we see on the ground. They were really, the basic and the advanced Eyecare workflows in the past really kind of addressed the needs of a hospital system or a really large institution that had the resources to have all these complicated systems in place. The Real World Model 2 is really one that recognizes that we have an electronic healthcare system with, DICOM capabilities and imaging display capabilities, and we just want certain images. We don't want to really load up, thousands and thousands of images, that may not even necessarily ever be viewed again. So that really takes those needs into consideration, and as a result, it's a very efficient and lean workflow that accommodates the needs of a smaller practice. And then finally, we have the Real World Model 3. Now, the Real World Model 3 recognizes that not every EHR system out there has DICOM or imaging capabilities, so we didn't want to leave them out. We still need a workflow that accommodates, the system with that level of capabilities. So we have a practice management system that, again, is pretty much the same, but the roles of an electronic health record system have changed a little bit. Now, instead of supplying work lists or orders, directly to the acquisition devices, we have the concept of, we do have an image manager or a PACS system, if you want to call it that, that has assumed those roles, but we need those orders from the electronic health record system. But unfortunately, the health record system does not have any DICOM capabilities whatsoever. So, but they may have HL7 capabilities. HL7 is a much lighter framework that is a lot easier to get onto. So as a result, the orders will be supplied directly to the image manager using the HL7 standard, and then the image manager is going to supply the work list directly to the acquisition modalities using DICOM. And then other capabilities are the same. So as you can see, they're all essentially just a shuffling around of responsibilities and using different standards to recognize the different technical realities that are on the ground with the different kinds of systems. Now again, all of these real-world models, they talk about a practice management system or electronic health record system, and that's because that's what is very common. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a practice management system. You can incorporate any of these actors, but the transactional flow does need to be considerate of the models that we have here. So if we can go to the next slide. Now, there's all sorts of actors and transactions, and as you can see, this this sheet here basically kind of defines what the actors are and what the transactions are, and then you have the different models here. So as you'll notice that in model 1 there's a bunch of R's all the way down, and then model 2 there's a bunch of R's but they're not as much, and then you have model 3 which has different R's on it. So the R's essentially means that these are required. So if you want to be compliant with the real world model 1 and your practice management system, then essentially the patient registration source, patient registration Eyecare 15 transaction is a required transaction for Model 1. And in fact, as you can see here for the patient registration source, that patient registration transaction is required on all 3 models. So there is, regardless of the model, there are some things that kind of carry over and are the same. But for instance, in the order filler, you have the patient demographics update. Well, for one type of system, or the real world model 1, that transaction is required, but in model 2, it's not. So basically what you need to do as an organization is basically define what role are you going to play within this workflow, and then once you've defined that role, for instance, if you're an acquisition modality, you're going to look at what transactions are typically required of that type of modality, and then you're going to go to each real-world model to find out what transactions are required for each model. So if you can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Abdiel, we are at 30 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to speed this up a little bit. So essentially, we can go to the next slide. I mean, these are all technical details, and they're just shuffling of the same kind of information. But the key thing is that you just recognize that there's certain things that are required for certain transactions that are required for each kind of model. Now we have the refractive measurements. And now the refractive measurements, it's basically, recognizes that refractive devices may not have all the capabilities that maybe a full acquisition modality has. A refractive measurement, typically, they're sitting on a table that they don't have, the operating systems that maybe an acquisition modality has, and all the technical capabilities. So it's basically a simple standard to make information easily accessible to the other systems from these refractive type of devices. So it's an extension of Eyecare to standardize the way that refractive measurements are sent to EHR systems. It addresses different scenarios, but the key thing is that they're all based on the JOIA specification. Now, the reason the Japan Ophthalmic Instruments Association standard was used is because it was largely already done, and it was very complete, and we decided that, with maybe a few changes, we can actually incorporate that. But there's 2 basic workflow models that are defined. One is assuming that the data is being sent without a patient identifier, and the other one is assuming that a patient identifier is being sent. One of the realities that we find with refractive devices is that maybe they don't support workless capabilities. There's no way to get a patient ID into that system, and maybe putting a patient ID is impractical, manually. So we do recognize that a patient ID is not always practical to achieve or to have. So we do have a workflow defined with each of these realities. So if we can go to the next slide. So essentially, here we have an example of a refractive measurement workflow with no patient ID. We have a practice management systems that provides the demographics and appointments to an electronic health record system. And then we somehow establish a patient context between the refractive device and the electronic health record system. Now, they help the patient context basically allows the refractive device to obtain patient information, but you'll notice there's a couple of dots there because we may not have that capability. This is typically a proprietary type of integration. Maybe the refractive device has the technical ability to do these things, but those things are not defined within the standard. What is defined is what leaves the refractive device and goes to the electronic health record system. So essentially, establishing a patient context is generic. It's however the implementer decides to implement that. But what is specifically defined is the JOIA standard, and we'll have an example of that. But the key thing is here that there's no patient ID. It's just going from the refractive device. It can apply to any patient, and it's a responsibility essentially of the electronic health record system to somehow establish that patient context. And then we have the next slide, which basically looks as having a valid ID. And in this case, the ID is basically put into the refractive device. Again, that could be through some sort of proprietary integration, or maybe somebody just types it in. But the patient ID is being sent along with the XML data, to the electronic health record system. And then the electronic health record system now has an XML-based data stream that can incorporate these specific measurements as discrete elements into the electronic health record system. So if we go to the next slide, so essentially with the refractive measurements, we have computers that kind of enable, the different, roles that are here. So just for the sake of time, we're going to move on. And then, now one of the things about JOIA is that this is an XML file-based specification, and IHE uses version 1.5. There's many versions out there. We've defined 1.5. There's different kinds of data objects that, we call data classifications. One that, kind of group the different kinds of refractions, or measurements, I should say. We have one from a refraction, or keratometers, or tonometers, or lensometers. So you could have one or more data classifications in a single file, but how you get the XML file from the device to the EHR system or whatever system that wants to incorporate these things is not defined. Okay, that's not the goal of this. The different, unfortunately, that aspect of it may be proprietary. We are working maybe in the future to kind of more specifically design the transport mechanism, or maybe not. But the XML file format itself is what is defined. How you get that XML from one place to another is really up to the implementers. And then we're also working with JOIA to add a new data classification for the autophoropters, which we expect that to be done, by the end of the year. Next slide. So this is what an XML JOIA looks like. And not to bore you with all these technical details, but if you notice, there's that common, root element, which has, information about the machine and the time of acquisition. Then you also have a patient root element. They're kind of minimized just for display here, but basically in that patient element, you have all the patient data. You may have operator information in there as well, but the key thing is here is the measurement. So you notice that type LM is being defined there. As a lensometer, essentially, and you have diopters and axes and prisms and cylinders and all these discrete technical information that is part of that, and that way it can be easily parsable by a third-party system. And it's a more modern standard than what we're using today. A lot of the refractive measurements are using, delimiter-based text files or serial-based communications. This is an effort to really depart from that and to go to a standard that is universal for all the refractive devices that are out there. And the next slide. Okay, so just to, what's the purpose of the IHE or Unified Eyecare workflow is, we want an automated workflow that keeps patient safety in mind. It's designed to, be specifically designed for practice management systems, electronic record systems, and image management, and so on and so forth. We're going to deal with patient demographics, appointments, billing information, images and refractive measurements, and then reports. You know, there's other things that may be required. You know, you know, you can possibly integrate. You know, those are not part of this workflow, but that doesn't mean that they're invalid. And the whole goal of this is to put patient information one time. You put it in the practice management system, and then that patient information is then transferred throughout all the devices in the practice. You know, so at this point, the American Academy of Ophthalmology recommends that clinicians purchase systems that implement the unified eye care workflow profile. So essentially, vendors are, you know, with time as they incorporate these things, you know, and you're providing your DICOM integration statements, you know, we're going to be essentially educating consumers that, you know, to make sure that whatever device that they purchase, you know, is compliant with the unified eye care workflow. So, you know, really right now out in the field, we see a lot of, yeah, I support DICOM. Well, that may mean nothing. You know, you may support DICOM, but do you really, you know, have a viable workflow in place? The Unified Eye Care workflow is designed to explicitly define these workflows. And then, you know, so the Academy is going to be promoting, you know, or with the help of vendors, you know, the Unified Eye Care workflow profile. And also vendors who incorporate the Unified Eye Care workflow. We encourage you to actually, you know, start promoting this and making consumers aware of the existence of this. And the key thing is that, you know, you may say, I support DICOM, but that does not necessarily guarantee that you're going to have a good experience with DICOM and that all your workflow needs are going to be met. The Unified Eye Care workflow absolutely addresses those needs, and there's a lot of things that are in it that make sure that we don't have the common implementation issues that we see on the ground. One of the key things before I finalize here is that when you're looking at the Unified Eye Care workflow, there's really three things that you really need to pay attention to. And those things are anything that says shall. If it says shall, you probably be a good idea to even, you know, search for the word shall, because that means it's really important and it's not optional. You know, so make sure you're paying attention to that. Make sure you're also paying attention to the notes. The notes, you know, we recognize when we're in the development of these things that there were a lot of implementation issues and real-world problems that maybe weren't defined in the past that this attempts to address. So the notes, you know, can be considered requirements in some cases, and they may alter your implementation. So if you don't pay attention to the notes, that note may come back to bite you later and may even require a significant overhaul of whatever you've designed. So pay real special attention to the notes and the expected actions because they can basically ruin your implementations. You know, but again, you know, this was specifically written to help eliminate confusion of the previous profiles. The previous profiles were very generic and really didn't, you know, define, you know, how these things are used in the real world. This is designed to eliminate that confusion, and it's also designed to prevent the implementation issues that we saw on the ground when we were trying to implement the basic and the advanced. So all those lessons learned are essentially incorporated into the Unified Eye Care workflow and are really designed to streamline the implementation and the design of your systems.